So we think that weight gain, weight loss is all about the individual, about willpower, and about calories. That's almost all wrong. Your body regulates body fat sort of like a thermostat. So if your body wants to be at a certain body fat percentage, if you get too fat, you're actually going to turn down your hunger until you lose that weight. If you lose weight, your body activates hunger and tries to push it back up. Body fat percentage is set at a certain level. You take somebody who's 160 pounds, you put them in an experiment where you force feed them, make them gain 20 pounds. Once you stop the experiment, so their weight's going up, but their body fat thermostat's down here still, they will actually eat very, very little for like weeks until their body comes back to normal. But it's effortless because it's the hunger that's the problem, and because their body fat thermostat, which is controlled by all these hormones. Certain things push it up and certain things push it down. So you want to control those hormones. Just telling somebody to eat fewer calories is just such a disastrously incorrect advice. It's the don't drink so much alcohol advice to the alcoholic. Helped nobody ever. Yeah, don't eat so many calories is like the height of scientific understanding. Like, no. That's horribly simplistic. It's quite incorrect.
Jason, when it comes to weight loss, you emphasize we need to be focusing on hunger instead of calories. Talk about why.
Yeah, it's really trying to understand eating behavior at a deeper level. So, as I talked about in the obesity code, calories are not everything. However, the other thing is, if you do think about calories like we're eating too much, then it's not simply that we're eating too much. It's why we're eating too much. You always got to get to the root of the problem. That is to say that if you're eating too much, you can't just say eat less, right? Because you never understood why you're eating in the first place. So let me give you an example. So if you have somebody who is an alcoholic, you could easily say alcoholism equals alcohol in minus alcohol out, right? Just like calories in minus calories out, right? So therefore, is the solution to simply tell somebody, oh, you should drink less alcohol. And hey, guess what? I just solved alcoholism, the whole problem, right? No, of course not, right? Because you never solve the problem of why they were drinking more alcohol than they were metabolizing, right? And maybe it's addiction, maybe it's depression, and you got to treat that underlying cause, right? Don't just treat the surface layer sort of alcohol in minus alcohol out, right? Or you have somebody who's a cocaine addict. That's just cocaine in minus cocaine out, right? Well, then just tell somebody, hey, take less cocaine, right? And did I solve their problem? Hell no, right? I didn't do anything. You'd think that's a stupid guy, right? Yet when you apply the exact same logic to calories, people say, oh, well, it's the first law of thermodynamics and it's inevitable, it's physics, right? It's like, no, it's stupid, right? It's the same argument because it's not the fact that people are eating more calories in than calories out. It's that, why is it? And the answer is because they're hungry, right? So you eat because you're hungry and you stop eating because you're full. And it's really as simple as that. So if you focus in on this sort of shallow first order thinking calories level, then you'd say just eat fewer calories, right? And you think that's the answer, just like you think telling people to, to drink less alcohol and take less cocaine is the answer to worldwide addiction problems, right? It clearly is not, right? And then you have to say, well, why is it that people are hungry, right? That's the real question. Because hunger has nothing to do with calories. Everybody thinks that if you don't eat for a while, you're going to get hungry. And to some extent, it's true, but it's not the full answer. Because if you think about hunger, and you take a wide range of people and you say, okay, let's see when people are most hungry, let's see when they're least hungry. And if you do this for a lot of people, what you find is that there's a natural circadian rhythm, and people are the least hungry that they will be in the day at 8 a.m. And they will be the most hungry that they are in the day at 8 p.m. That's just an average of sort of a lot of people. These are when you do lots of surveys. So 8 a.m. is the period of time where you have gone the longest without food because you slept, right? You just woke up and there's probably been at least 10 hours, 12 hours, right? If you ate at 8 p.m. and you ate at 8 a.m., right? It's been 12 hours since you ate, and yet you're the least hungry. So clearly it's not just that you haven't eaten for a while. And the same thing at 8 p.m. Well, you just ate, a few hours ago, right? At 12 or 1 or 2, and that you're more hungry than you've ever been, even though it's shorter than the period of time. So it's clearly controlled by something else, right? And it's controlled largely by hormones. And the thing is that you have to understand which hormones are important and which are not. Same with satiety. So what makes you full? And it's not just stuff in your stomach that makes you full. It's not calories that makes you full. There are satiety hormones and there are hunger hormones. So if you have a lot of satiety hormones, you don't want to eat anymore. And it's really quite, everybody knows this, right? So if you eat steak and eggs, if you take an 800-calorie breakfast of steak and eggs or a vegetable omelet, 3-egg omelet, um, you're going to be full until noontime. If you drink 800 calories of frappuccino, you're going to be hungry right after, right? So why would you, why on earth would any thinking human think that all calories are the same, which is that a calorie is a calorie, right? That's stupid. You haven't managed the hunger, even though you've taken the same calories. You've not managed the hunger because on one hand, you ate that 3-egg omelet, you're totally stuffed for, 4, 5, 6 hours until lunchtime versus 800 calories of frappuccino, right? So there's a big difference with all the calories. And therefore, there's a big difference in terms of eating behavior. So ignoring the sort of hunger hormones, the satiety hormones is really, um, is really a big mistake when people are trying to lose weight because they're not understanding why it is that we eat. Right. And that's the hunger. Right. And there's actually different types of hunger, which I go into in the hunger code.
Well, let's get practical. We know hunger is the root now. You've explained why. We know it's hormonal. How do we practically work with our hormones to control the hunger?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's where you really have to look into a couple of things. So let's get away from calories because clearly calories is not a physiologic construct, right? What that means is that our body runs on hormones. We grow because the hormones tell us to. We get hungry because our hormones tell us to. We get full when the hormones tell us to. So let's start with satiety. What are the hormones that make you full? Because this is how you stop eating, right? You can eat one hamburger, but could you eat 50? I doubt it. I don't think anybody could, truthfully. And why is it? It's the same hamburger. It's because you're full. You've activated these satiety hormones so that you physically cannot eat anymore. So these hormones include things like GLP-1. So GLP-1 is the hormone that's activated by drugs, weight loss drugs, like tirzepatide or semaglutide, that is Ozempic or Mounjaro, for example. So when you stimulate these satiety hormones through these drugs, you're going to be full and you're not going to want to eat, right? And so the question is, how do you naturally stimulate these satiety hormones? Well, the best things are going to be proteins. So proteins have a very strong effect on GLP-1s, GIPs, incretins, glucose to some extent, but also fiber. Fiber is actually a very interesting one because it has multiple roles. So GLP-1 is one of the big ones. So fiber, what it does is it actually goes to the colon where it gets fermented into these short chain fatty acids like butyrate. And those short chain fatty acids actually activate GLP-1, so they cause satiety. So if you're to eat a lot of fibrous foods, not only is it very bulky, which we'll talk about in a second, but it moves through and it causes these increase in GLP-1s and satiety. So fiber is a great thing. Proteins are a great thing. The bulk of the food also plays a role. So fiber has sort of these dual effects. And so when you fill up the stomach with like a lot of stuff, then it activates these baroreceptors in the stomach. And these baroreceptors basically are stretch receptors. So when you stretch the stomach wall, it actually your stomach will sense it and send signals through the vagus nerve to tell your body to stop eating. So if you have a pathological condition such as when people eat their hair and stuff, you get a bezoar, so the hair fills up the stomach. But people get very full, not just because the stomach is full, because it's stretched out, right? So the body senses that. So on the other hand, if you think about ultra processed foods are actually designed to make you eat more. And it's because they want to minimize satiety. So if you want to lose weight, you got to maximize satiety. But if you want somebody to buy a lot of that food, like if you're a food company, you want to process this food so that it minimizes satiety. Why? Because if people are eating foods that don't make them full, they can keep eating those foods and therefore they will eat more of those foods, which means they will buy more of those foods and you as a company will sell more of that and make more money, right? So if you think about a lot of ultra processed foods like commercial white bread or Cheetos or something like that, they're actually engineered to be almost the exact opposite of satiety. So generally low in protein, like you think about potato chips or Cheetos or something like that. White bread, commercial white bread. It's very, very low in protein, so you don't get the GLP-1 effect. They take out all the fiber, so you lose that GLP-1 effect, you lose that volume effect. You take out the fats, so natural fats activate something called cholecystokinin. Proteins also activate something called peptide YY. So you want to have things that are the opposite, and you want them not to be heavy. Things that are heavy or sit in the stomach or bulky tell your body to stop eating. So therefore, all of these things like the commercial white bread, they almost dissolve in your mouth. They're very soft. They're easily pushed through, so they move through the stomach very quickly. So if you're moving through the stomach quickly, then you're not activating those baroreceptors. So that's why a very sort of easy thing to do is to really try and cut out ultra processed foods, and that's going to get you sort of like 90% to where you want to be, because of this effect of ultra processed foods on satiety. That is, they're always trying to minimize it. So what I often emphasize is eating sort of natural foods. If you leave that as your sort of number one rule, eat foods that look like they do in nature, sort of thing, right? Or eat traditional foods. We know that there simply wasn't that much obesity despite a lot of calories being available. So yeah, that's one of the things. One of the other things that we talk about for sort of satiety effects, there's a couple of things that we use in the fasting method to help boost satiety, especially during fasting and stuff. Because again, fasting, you're going to lose that effect on the stomach because you're not stretching the stomach. You may get hungry. So two of the things that we talk about a lot is one is bone broth. So bone broth is a very traditional food, getting very popular. And how it's made is you simply take bones and you simmer them down. But it takes like 15 or 16 hours because a lot of those proteins and stuff that are in the bones needs to come out, and that just takes time. So you have to take the chicken bones or pork bones or beef bones. You can roast them to increase the flavor, but then you simmer it down so that what you get is this liquid. And sometimes when you put it in the fridge, it's sort of this gelatinous sort of jelly-like consistency, and that's all the protein that's gone into the bone broth. So because it largely contains, it sometimes has a bit of fat, but you can skim it off if you don't like the flavor of that. But because it really just contains some protein, it's just water and protein, it can help with the satiety. And the other thing is that when you're doing fasting, for example, it's a great thing to take as a meal sort of replacement almost. Like if you're sitting down with somebody, at least you can take a bit of broth and not be completely absent from the meal. But by the time you finish that nice hot soup, you felt like there's a little bit of volume there to give you the satiety. There's the proteins. The big problem is that it takes time to make. And so a lot of people ask us, can I just use like commercial bone broth and stuff? And that stuff is not very good. Most of the time, it has no protein. which is what you want. And most of the time, it contains a lot of artificial flavor. So monosodium glutamate and all those stuff. And these flavor enhancers, again, are working against you because these flavor enhancers that they put into ultra processed foods, particularly, are not there to increase satiety. They're there to increase hunger, right? So if you put in all these flavor enhancers, what happens? Well, hey, this commercial soup is very good, so you want to drink more. So they sell more, right? But now you're not trying to create satiety, you're creating hunger, which is the problem, right? So understand that all these food companies, they're looking after their bottom lines. So they're putting in things that sort of work against you because they're trying to make you eat more. So what we've done at the fasting method, actually, we've developed some a powdered bone broth, which is actually, I think, very interesting. It's called Aera, AEIRA. It's at drinkera.com. And it's basically a powdered bone broth. So there's only one ingredient in it, which is chicken bones. So they've taken the chicken bones, they've simmered them, got all the proteins and stuff out, and then dehydrated it. So it's in a powder. So it's actually a really useful product because what it means is that you can simply make bone broth instead of taking 15, 18 hours to make. It's actually, you just stir it up in 5 minutes. You have natural bone broth with no other enhancers or anything. Like you can add your own salt and stuff. So bone broth is one of the things, and one of the, with the Era powdered bone broth, we've tried to really take out the pain point of how long it takes to make. It's a very traditional food too, bone broth. I mean, you can buy the stuff that's in a liquid, but it's a little less convenient because you have to keep it refrigerated. My mom and my mother-in-law used to make it sort of every day almost, right? They're every day they just get the bones and they make the soup and that's it, right? It was just a natural thing. So that's one of the things that I think helps to control the hunger. The other thing we talk a lot about is green tea, particularly, as well as coffee, and the way these work are a little different. So I've the green tea, what it does is it reduces, it affects a enzyme called COMT, which breaks down adrenaline and noradrenaline. And what happens there is that the sympathetic tone goes up. So when you block the COMT, the sympathetic tone goes up. And the sympathetic tone is your fight or flight response. When you activate your sympathetic nervous system, you actually decrease your appetite, right? Because when you activate your fight or flight response, for example, say, you see a lion and you're scared, you don't think, wow, I'm really hungry, right? Because the sympathetic nervous system is gearing your body up for action. So it shuts down your appetite and it starts to flood your body with glucose from its stored sources, from the liver and all that. It pushes the glucose out so you can either fight or run away. So again, if you think about going into wars, we don't do that anymore. But if you're playing like an intense game of tennis or basketball, nobody's thinking, oh yeah, I could really use a hamburger right now, right? You're too involved in the whole game. So that increase in sympathetic tone actually reduces hunger, and that's the green tea has a very small effect of that. Caffeine is again, there's a bit of caffeine in there, which causes that. So you can use coffee as well. So all of these are sort of natural appetite suppressants. And the green tea has a lot of advantages, one of which is that you can just keep drinking it through the day. There's no calories. There's a lot of antioxidants called ECGC. If you study it, anything that increases the sympathetic tone decreases hunger. And that's, in fact, many drugs have this effect. So if you think about nicotine is a very powerful anti appetite suppressant. That's why people who smoke are actually thinner. Now, there's lots of other problems with nicotine, but there's clearly this effect on weight that they are skinnier. When people stop smoking, they actually gain weight. And the effect of this is probably from the increase in sympathetic tone. So again, we're talking about the hormones of hunger, which is getting to the physiologic understanding of how our body works, as opposed to this very simplistic and completely wrong idea that you need to eat 500 calories and then you'll be full. Like, no, you may be full if you eat the right foods, or you may not be full if you don't, right? So focus on those foods, focus on the hunger.
Ultra processed foods have come up a couple times. Let's take that from the angle of blood sugar. When we eat those, our blood sugar is going to spike, and oftentimes you're going to have a crash afterward. Let's connect that to hunger.
Oh yeah, that's actually been known. I actually looked at this study. It was from the 70s. Actually, they looked at the processing of foods, and what they find is that the speed with which glucose rises. So remember, glucose, carbohydrates are chains of glucose. Okay. So if you have bread or rice or potatoes, they're made of of a molecule called either amylopectin or amylose. And that's the way that one is highly branched and one is linear. So any potatoes, rice, whatever, they're all carbohydrates, which are amylopectin and amylose, which are chains of glucose, all arranged in a long chain. When your body gets it, it will chop that chain of glucose into glucose and then it'll go up. Now, if you have a carbohydrate that's slow to digest, then the rise in glucose is going to be, it'll still go up, but it'll go up slowly and gradually. That's not so bad. What's really bad is when you have this huge spike of glucose that goes up. Then what happens is it forces your body to spike the insulin, because insulin is what, follows, right? It takes the glucose and it pushes it into the cells for it to use its energy. But this really super high spike like that, it's your body really can't handle it very well. So what happens is that it tends to overshoot. So not only do you get this big spike in glucose followed by this spike in insulin, it forces so much glucose in that it goes down below normal. So now your glucose is going down below normal, which is called hypoglycemia, which can stimulate shaking and extreme hunger. So this is what happens when you eat sort of white bread and jam in the morning, which is basically pure carbohydrate and pure ultra processed carbohydrate. So if you eat these ultra processed carbohydrates and you're getting these massive spikes, then you simply can't handle it. And then by 10:30, when it goes too low, you're getting hungry. So by 10:30, you simply can't. You need to eat something. You're getting shaky. You're getting hangry, and all this sort of stuff. Now, if you had eaten the same carbohydrate, same amount of carbohydrate, but in a sort of slow, gradual movement, so you can do this by eating less processed carbohydrates. So, if it has a lot of fiber, for example, it's going to slow it down. If you're going to eat the carbohydrate with other things, such as vinegar, for example, it tends to slow it down. So if you get this sort of more gradual, you don't get this big drop in where you get the hypoglycemic hunger. So the refined carbohydrates tend to be very, very bad. And this is one of the when we're talking about ultra processed foods, many of us understand that they're bad, and they're bad for a number of reasons, including a lot of the chemicals that they add, right? So the flavor enhancers, the texturizers, the emulsifiers, all those sort of things are actually designed to stimulate hunger rather than, satiety. But the other thing is that refined carbohydrates in particular are very bad. Refined, fats and refined proteins may or may not be bad. I still think they're bad, but not to the same degree as refined carbohydrates. So the ultra processed carbohydrates, you get, even if you get the same amount of carbohydrates, same amount of calories, it's the speed of the absorption that makes it a problem. And this applies to other things, right? So if you think about nicotine, smoking, why do you smoke alcohol? Well, because it delivers the nicotine directly into your lungs, which goes then directly into the blood vessels. So you get this big spike in the smoke, the nicotine, as opposed to if you were to use nicotine gum, for example. So you use nicotine gum because it's less addictive, right? Why? Because you're getting this more gradual rise in nicotine and then down, as opposed to a massive spike in nicotine up. Same thing with drugs, right? Why do you inhale cocaine? Why do you inject heroin directly into the veins? Because you want this massive spike that goes up, right? If you were to eat cocaine, might have an effect, but not as big an effect, right? And sometimes they use it for marijuana and stuff, right? You use edibles as opposed to smoking it because you want a sort of slower onset and offset. But the point is the same, right? Whether you're talking about glucose or whether you're talking about cocaine or nicotine, it's the same. The addictive effect is this big spike, right? The speed that it gets absorbed into the body plays a huge role in its physiologic effect, right? You can't just say that, well, nicotine is nicotine. It's the same thing, right? It's not the same thing. Smoking is different than nicotine gum. It just is, right?
And this is even applicable for people that are eating quote unquote healthy foods, like, say, paleo desserts based with almond flour, where the particle size has been changed mechanically, and then these other foods have been made, or a smoothie, where you're taking fruit and you're blending it
Absolutely.
up. So, highlight the importance here of looking at changes in the food and the particle size.
Yeah, so this is the important thing is that if you think about how we go from food to weight gain, everybody thinks it's food, calories, weight gain. No, that's simplistic and completely wrong. Like it's completely incorrect. So if you think it's just food, calories, weight gain, well, you've got a flawed model in your head. It's the food, right? Which is like, say, an apple, for example. You've got a certain number of calories, you've got a certain number of macronutrients, whatever. But then you have to take into account the next step, which is digestion. So you got to take that apple, you got to digest it. Digestion is what our body does to make it ready for absorption, which is the next step. So it goes into the stomach, it gets churned around, it gets mixed with stomach acid, and then it gets pushed out slowly into the small intestines. Because remember, the stomach acts as a reservoir, so it holds food there. Because when you're eating your meal, you're eating more at that time than you can absorb. So your body holds some of it, churns it around, mixes it all around, and then shoots out little pieces, boluses, to your small intestines. So it goes food, then digestion, then absorption. So absorption is where particle size might be important because if you have very, very fine particles like flour, so remember, flour, machine ground flour is very, very fine, right? You throw it up and it's like, it's the dust, right? So if you're using stone ground flour, for example, it's much heavier, much larger particles. And the difference is that your body doesn't absorb it as fast. So when you have small particles, absorption spikes up like this. When you have large particles, it's going to go slowly. When you have a lot of fiber, it's going to slow it down. So it goes food to digestion to absorption, which affects your hormones, which affects your hunger, satiety, which affects your eating behavior, which affects your weight, right? So it's a huge long chain. And every step of the way, there are ways that you can modify it, right? So you can modify the calories, but there's ways to modify the digestion, for example. There's because if you eat whole foods, it comes out of the body slow. It comes out of the stomach slower. So if you take the same food, and there's been such interesting studies, for example. So if you take an apple and you compare apple slices to apple puree, so applesauce, which is the same apple, you just bake it and puree it, right? So same number of calories, same number of carbs, same food. Everything is the same, but the baking and the pureeing has pre-digested that food, right? It's like baby food, right? So if you take that and you compare apple slices to applesauce, exact same ingredients, the physiologic effect is quite different. There's a much higher insulin effect. Your blood glucose spikes up much faster if you measure how quickly it exits the stomach. The apple slices takes about 65 minutes to exit the stomach, and the applesauce takes about 44 minutes. So much faster, coming out much faster for the same food. It's the digestion and absorption that has affected it. And because it affects the speed of absorption, it affects the insulin and the hormones. Because again, if you take those apple slices, remember, it's not coming out of the stomach so quickly. So it's going to keep your stomach more full for longer. So you're not going to want to eat later on. which is exactly what they found, of course. In the study, they found that, if you give people sort of an all-you-can-eat buffet after they gave these apples or applesauce, people ate less after they ate the apples. Right, so it's quite an interesting thing because it's like there's so many steps. We know this because we spent, hundreds of years understanding human digestion and hormones and all that. And yet, when it comes to weight gain, we like to throw that all out the window and say, oh, food, calories, weight gain. It's like, well, what about all these other physiologic processes that make a huge difference in how our raw body responds to those foods, right? So the ultra processed foods, the speed of absorption, particle size, all of these things makes a difference. And if you ignore that, then you're going to you're going to lose a lot of the tools that we can use, like eating apples instead of applesauce. Smoothies actually are a very interesting thing because if you actually if you take a smoothie and you blend in strawberries or passion fruit or raspberries, the absorption is actually slower. So where you think, oh, smoothies are bad for you, if you blend in like some, passion fruit or seeded fruit, the absorption actually goes down like 20-30%. And it's because the blending actually breaks up the seeds, which contain a lot of fiber and polyphenols and all these other things, and actually slows down the absorption. So if you take a strawberry smoothie, for example, it may be better than your regular smoothie. And I think that the study they actually did was like mango versus mango plus passion fruit or something like that. And again, big difference when you blend those seeded fruits. So in some cases, the blending actually may help. In some cases, it will do worse, like apples versus applesauce.
I've heard Dr. Robert Lustig talk about blending and how that changes the structure of fiber, like you're talking about here with the seeds. But the way he explains it is that the insoluble forms a lattice, and then the soluble binds to that. And together, if the fiber is unchanged, that's when you slow digestion or absorption, actually. So that's
You
just
can
a little bit of nuance there onto what you just shared. There's obviously different scenarios where it's going to be impacted differently.
Yeah, and this is where understanding a little bit can be useful because there are certain foods that form this sort of viscous layer and slows absorption, just like Dr. Lustig said. So sometimes it's the fiber, so that's fine. But fiber has actually multiple effects. So not just that, but also in some cases, like chia seeds, for example. You know how when you put chia seeds in water, it forms this sort of slimy duck, right? It's the same thing that happens in your body, but when you're forming this sort of viscous sort of slime, it's actually quite good. I actually love chia seeds, but it's sort of this viscous solid. Um, that also slopes absorption because again, it sort of coats along the inside, and therefore, when you're trying to absorb other carbohydrates, it actually is slower because it's got to make its way through this sort of viscous layer that the chia seed has actually created. So, just like the fiber, how it can create this sort of the soluble, insoluble can sort of form this lattice that slows absorption. Other things can do the same thing. So again, it's important to understand these things because these are all the nuances. Like when we try to simplify things and say it's just calories, you're losing all the nuance of these different foods. And that's why a lot of these, people say, oh, I took chia seeds and I did great. It's like, yeah, it's possible. It's definitely possible that you would do better using some of these foods. And I always think it's strange how we dumb it down to a single concept of calories and think that we're the most scientifically accurate representation of weight gain when it's like crazy. It's like you've lost all the complexity of food science that we've spent so long trying to sort of decode. And so, yeah, I think that certainly can play a role. But fiber is great. Chia seeds are great. Like, blended fruits can be useful. You're still getting a lot of fructose in it, like, from the other stuff. So, but it's not the worst thing you could do.
Earlier, you quickly mentioned vinegar as a tool to hack into this controlling the hunger. Can you talk about how somebody would do that practically?
Yeah, so vinegar actually is super interesting because it reduces the digestibility of starches. So again, if you think about vinegar, what it is it's an organic acid, and you can get the same effect with, so vinegar is acetic acid. So you can get the same effect with fermented foods. So that's lactic acid. So sauerkraut, kimchi, you can get the same effect with citric acid as well. So all of these organic acids inhibit amylase. So when you have a starch, you're getting chains of glucose. You need to chop these chains of glucose, and that's using a enzyme called amylase. And there's two places you get the amylase, in the saliva and in the pancreas. So as soon as you start eating the bread, the salivary amylases start working. If you eat bread with vinegar, like you dip it in olive oil and vinegar, like traditionally, then the amylases in your saliva are inhibited by the organic acid, the vinegar, and therefore less. You don't chop up the glucose as quickly, which means that you're slowing the absorption. So instead of getting that huge spike, you're getting the sort of more gradual thing, which makes a difference. So it can work very well. So all of these things are actually traditionally done, right? Like people have dipped their bread in vinegar, like sushi rice is vinegared rice, right? If you eat potato salad, you just add a splash of vinegar. So all of these things have been done, and maybe because they actually slow down the absorption, which makes it a lot better. Because again, when you're slowing down the absorption, you're not going to get this thing we talked about, the massive spike up and the massive spike down, where you actually go down below normal blood glucose. You're sort of leveling out your blood glucose levels. Even though the vinegar has very few calories, it's the acid that you're after. And people have talked about it for a long time, how eating fermented foods is good for you, and vinegar. So all of these things impact the hunger because of the way that our body digests them.
While we're on this theme of controlling that blood sugar spike, a couple other things that come to my mind are walking before or after meals and the order we eat food. Can you talk to those and then any other hacks or tools in that realm?
Yeah, I talk all about this in the hunger code, which is it's super super interesting that if you're trying to avoid those spikes up, walking after a meal is actually incredibly powerful. So what they did was they compared people, and they simply gave them a reference meal, and they had them walk before a meal versus after a meal. So if you walk and then you eat, it makes no difference. Like your blood sugar after the meal does exactly the same as it would if you didn't walk. But if you walk after the meal, then it's much blunted. So it instead of going way up like that, it goes up slower, and the effect lasts about a half an hour. And it's sort of like the sooner you walk after a meal, the bigger the effect. After about half an hour, it doesn't do a whole lot because again, probably a lot of the stuff has passed through. The mechanism could be several, but it could be that you're using some of the glucose. So instead of going up so much, you're leaving some of it so that you can use it. Could be that by diverting the blood flow to your legs for walking or whatever, you're slowing the digestion. Therefore, you're slowing how quickly the food is passes through the stomach for absorption. They haven't gone that far, but you can actually blunt the rise of that glucose by a good, again, 20-30%. These are not huge effects. They're not the same effects that you see with, drugs, right? There you get massive effects. But these are all natural, right? So going for a walk after a meal, very enjoyable, very pleasurable. You can make it into a nice habit that you can do and enjoy with your, friends or significant other, sort of anytime, right? It's very powerful, and sometimes it's just that's all it is. The other one is the order of your foods, and this is again ties into something that I call trying to avoid naked carbohydrates, right? Naked carbohydrates is what I call basically pure carbohydrate. So it's white bread or low fat muffins or something like that, right? Almost pure carbohydrate. And the problem is that if you think about how we digest food, if you take a slice of white bread and jam, which is pure carbohydrate, you put it into the stomach churns it around, and then it shoots out these small, boluses of food for you to absorb. If you've got white bread and jam, all you've got is pure carbohydrate. What's coming out the stomach into the small intestines for absorption is 100% carbohydrate. If you eat a mixed meal, so carbohydrate along with vegetables and whatever, right? So you eat a hamburger instead of pure bread. You've got proteins, you've got fats, you've got carbs. But in the stomach, it's all going to get churned together. So when that bolus of food comes out into the intestines, you don't have 100% glucose. You have 30% proteins, 30% fat, and 30% glucose. Remember that proteins and fats are not glucose. Only carbohydrates are glucose. When you look at your blood glucose effect, instead of 100% boom like this, you got 30%, right? Because you've got all this other stuff that's churned up and mixed up in the stomach. So therefore, you're going to slow your rise. And again, what they did was a study, so interesting, which they took veggies and proteins, so chicken breasts, I think, and vegetables, and carbs. So they simply switched the order. So they had somebody eat the bread first, and then 10 minutes later or 15 minutes later, the chicken and veggies. And they also checked them when they ate the chicken and veggies first, and then the bread and orange juice. So the effect is very different when you eat the bread and orange juice first, you get this massive spike, get this massive drop, and your insulin effect is like 40, 50, 60% higher than if you simply switch the order of your food. So by switching and eating the veggies and proteins first, and then 10 minutes later eating the carbs, you're getting much less insulin effect. So you're getting, again, same food, exact same foods, but the hormonal effect is tremendously different, right? When you're eating the bread and orange juice 10 minutes before your chicken and veggies, what goes down is pure carbohydrate, 100% carbohydrate. When you start digesting, what comes out into the small intestines for absorption is 100% carbohydrate. And that's the big problem. You've got all this carbohydrate, you're going to get this massive glucose spike. There's no way around it, right? So all you have to do is switch the order. So instead of eating the bread first with, how a lot of restaurants give you bread first, there's a lot of problems with that because you're hungry, so you're going to eat more of the bread, and two, you're going to have this 100% carbohydrate. If you simply switch the orders, you're eating you're filling up, sort of, so to speak, with your proteins and veggies and all that sort of stuff. You're not only going to eat less carbohydrate later, right? Because you've eaten already. You're not going to eat as much of the bread later. But for the bread that you eat, for the carbohydrate you eat, you're going to get much less effect on the glucose, which is the hormones that ultimately affect the weight. And that's the real issue. So those two sort of hacks, they're hacks in a way, but they're also just understanding human physiology to make it work better for weight loss. If that's your goal, then you have to understand all of these things because it's the hormones that make the effect.
What about coming at hunger from the angle of getting rid of carbs or bringing them way down?
Yeah, so
Getting into ketosis, talk about it from that aspect.
Yeah, so there's two important things. So when we're talking about hunger, and I think we'll talk about this more in our other episode, there's actually several different ways, several different types of hunger. So far we've been covering sort of the physical hunger, which is this hormonal side of hunger, right? And that has all to do with insulin and cortisol and GLP-1s and GIP and sympathetic tone and all this sort of stuff, right? Sympathetic nervous system, the baroreceptor, so all of these systems. But that's the physical hunger. There's also a whole emotional side of the hunger, which is called hedonic hunger, where you're eating because of the pleasure of it, right? So if you were to say, why are you eating? It could be because you're hungry, you're physically hungry, But it could be that you simply want to eat because it looks good or it tastes good or it makes you feel better. And this is the classic, you both broke up with your girlfriend or boyfriend, eat a whole tub of ice cream. You're not eating it because you're hungry. You're eating it to make you feel better. And that's the whole idea, is that food can make you feel better. And therefore, it's important to understand this hedonic hunger because it can lead you to overeat, right? And that's where refined carbohydrates and ultra processed foods are very, very dangerous, because what they do is not only create this massive glucose spike, but they actually create these sort of massive dopamine spikes as well, especially with sugar. So we all know that if you eat very sweet foods, you get this massive rush, but you actually feel like it feels good. That's why people eat dessert, right? It's not because you're physically hungry. You've already eaten your steak or whatever, right? You're eating it because it looks good. And so the idea is that if you have not just sweet foods but ultra processed sweet foods, not only are you increasing the insulin, which increases, and you're increasing the dopamine spikes, which is your reward system in the brain, but you're also creating very minimal satiety, right? Because satiety is the problem. If you are full, then and you eat something that is still filling, even if it's sweet, it's hard to do because you can't eat, right? You're too full. That's why ultra processed foods, because they have very little satiety, can sneak in there still. Like, for example, if you eat all you can eat buffet, you go and you eat a lot of whatever you eat, right? And somebody says, "Here, eat these 2 pork chops because we're going to get charged for them." You're like, "Blah, I'm going to throw up," right? Because it's all proteins and fats, right? It's going to activate GLP-1, GIP, it's going to activate baroreceptors, it's going to activate all these satiety hormones. And your satiety hormones are already screaming at you to not eat anymore, right? So you can't eat those pork chops. But if somebody says, "Here, drink this, soda," you'd be like, "Sure." It could still be 500 calories. Or, "Here, have this ice cream, have this apple pie." You can still eat it. Why? Because there's no satiety effect, right? So this is the whole issue with ultra processed foods, is that you can keep pounding them down. So if you're eating it for an emotional reason, you can keep pounding down these ultra processed foods, right? So that's dangerous. It can wind up leading to sort of food addictions and so on. So that's where the ultra processed carbohydrates can be sort of very dangerous in those sort of circumstances.
Let's make sure we get into ketosis, though, and talk about from that aspect.
Right.
I don't know the exact mechanism, but I feel like it's independent of what we've been talking about. When somebody is in ketosis, hunger diminishes greatly. Can you talk to what that mechanism is and how you feel about that?
Yeah, there's not a lot of data that I've seen in terms of ketosis. I mean, ketosis is, when you're eating very, very low carbohydrates, you're not only going to reduce, you're going to reduce a lot of hormones, right? So you're going to reduce a lot of these things. You're going to have a lot of satiety because the ultra processed carbs have the low satiety. So eating a lot of proteins and so on are going to create a lot of satiety. But the ketosis may have a bigger role on insulin, which is, what we talked about a lot in the obesity code, because the insulin is probably reduces hunger through sort of a sort of slightly different mechanism. When your insulin levels are very high, it basically tells your body to store more energy, right? So that's its job, right? So don't forget that this is not an evil hormone; it's a normal hormone. It's just that if you have insulin, it's gonna tell your body to store calories, right? So normally when you eat, your insulin goes up and you're gonna store your calories. When insulin goes down, like when you fast, then you're going to release those calories, right? So in ketosis, your insulin levels tend to be very low because you're not eating a lot of carbohydrates. But because the effect of insulin is to increase or decrease your levels of body fat, right? Because that's its job. If you lower insulin levels, then your body simply doesn't want to store any more calories. And therefore you're going to impact the hunger, and your hunger is going to go down. So it probably works its way through insulin, the ketosis. I'm not sure if ketones themselves have an independent effect, but anytime you lower the insulin levels, you're going to tell your body to store fewer calories, which is going to, if your body is overweight, then it's going to notice that, hey, I already have a lot of stored calories, I don't need any more, and then decrease hunger. And this is the same way fasting can be very effective for reducing hunger. So it also induces ketosis. Same thing, right? Very low carbohydrates, nutrient insulin is a nutrient sensor. So fasting is going to reduce your insulin levels. And again, when you start getting people into these 4 or 5 day fasts, like, we do at the fasting method, we have these 5 day reset fasts. What people start to notice is that their hunger levels really start to go down. So it's possible that it's the ketones themselves that are causing this. I think it's all part of the same survival mechanism, truthfully. That when your body goes into ketosis or when it's fasting, which is very similar states, your body turns down the hunger because you don't actually, you don't want to be distracted by it all the time. You want to have energy to go out and hunt and gather and all this sort of stuff, right? So I think it's actually part of the same natural sort of evolutionary process that we've gone through. But fasting, you see exactly the same thing. When people are fasting at day 3, day 4, their hunger, their physical hunger, starts to really, really diminish. Like, people are just like, well, I'm not hungry at all. The hedonic hunger takes a little longer to affect because people are still looking at the food and thinking, oh, I would like to eat that. But the physical hunger really goes down. So I think it's the same effect. And I think it's primarily a sort of insulin effect. So, we talk about a bit in the hunger code, this sort of body fat thermostat, which is that your body regulates body fat sort of like a thermostat. Like, if you think about your room thermostat, you set it at a temperature and then it will it activates your heat or your air conditioning to maintain that temperature. And your body does the same sort of thing in terms of body fat percentage. So your body wants to be at a certain body fat percentage. If you get too fat, you're actually going to turn down your hunger. So you don't want to eat anymore until you lose that weight. If you lose weight, then your body activates hunger and tries to push it back up. So the key when you're trying to adjust the room temperature is to adjust the thermostat. You don't just say room temperature equals heat in minus heat out. So if I want to heat up my room, I put in a little space heater, right, and turn it on. Because again, the thermostat's going to detect that raised temperature, turn on the air conditioning, bring it down, right? So the key is to adjust this thermostat. Same thing in the body fat. The body fat percentage is set at a certain level. If you take a normal person and force feed them to make them gain weight, and they've done these experiments, you take somebody who's, say, 150, 160 pounds, you put them in an experiment where you force feed them, make them gain 20 pounds. They will. Once you stop the experiment, so their weight's going up, but their body fat thermostat's down here still, then they will actually eat very, very little for like weeks until their body comes back to normal. But it's effortless, right? Because it's the hunger that's the problem. And because their body fat thermostat, which is controlled by all these hormones, right? Insulin, GLP-1, GIP, sympathetic tone, cortisol, all of these things together, right? Certain things push it up and certain things push it down. So you want to control those hormones. And that's the same idea with the insulin, is that it's really affecting that body fat thermostat. And that's where I think ketosis works, is through that insulin effect.
So in the new book, we have our 3 types of hunger. We've spent the majority of this conversation talking about hormonal or homeostatic hunger. You touched on hedonic. Let's end on this. Bring in the 3rd type, conditioned, and how that fits into all this.
Conditioned hunger is the sort of social. So if you think about the hunger, there's the physical, which is called homeostatic hunger. There's the emotional, which is called hedonic hunger. And then there's the social environmental, which is conditioned hunger. And that's the hunger you get when you're it's through your habits and mindsets get built up. So if you are used to eating 6 times a day, you will get hungry 6 times a day. That's actually just normal. It's classical conditioned hunger is basically there's a whole field of science called behavioral psychology, which delves into sort of conditioning and counter conditioning. But essentially, it's the effect of your environment on you, and it does it through both conditioning and social modeling are the ways that your environment sort of imprints itself and makes your own behaviors change. And it's actually probably the most important of all of them and something we don't talk about. So we think that, weight gain, weight loss is all about the individual, about willpower, and about calories. That's almost all wrong because one, it's not about calories. There's a whole sort of complex human physiology that behind weight loss and weight gain that they've ignored. But it's also mostly a environmental problem. If you take somebody who is, a Japanese person in Japan, their risk of obesity is very low. Take the same Japanese person, plunk them down in San Francisco. Their risk of obesity within a generation has skyrocketed, double, triple, quadruple the risk in Japan. Why? Because the social aspects of eating behavior are different. If you think weight loss is all about, food and diets, like you've already lost. It's about eating behavior, how we eat. And how we eat makes a difference. There's so many interesting studies. So you can look at military families. There's a study on military families. When you move a military family into a area that has high obesity rates, they gain weight. If your best friend gains weight, your own risk of obesity goes up by like 171%. These are all social factors, right? Which means that we have to look at the system problems, right? It's crazy because if you imagine that you're like a school teacher and, one child fails. That might be the child's fault, right? They didn't study enough. They played too much video games. Well, what if 70 children fail? Is it just the children's fault? Or is it the teacher or learning systems or school's fault, right? It's probably one of those, not the children's fault, because so many children. Now we have a situation in America where 70% of people are overweight and obese. And we still persist in saying that it's an individual problem. Eat less, move more. It's a willpower problem. But it's not. It's a system problem. What is it about the American eating behavior that is causing all these Americans to gain weight? That's the important question. Ultra-processed foods plays a big role, but conditioning and social modeling, which are the environmental determinants of eating behavior, actually play a huge role as well. So those three types of hunger are very important because, again, you want to think about root causes, right? Why are we overeating? So one is that the overeating is partially a hormonal issue, right? So it's the hunger that's the issue, right? And then why are you hungry? Well, it's because of the homeostatic hunger, the hedonic hunger, and the conditioned hunger. And then how are you going to, correct those problems? And there's a few things that you can do, but all of those have different sort of solutions. They're different. They're different types of hunger. They have different solutions. And just telling somebody to eat fewer calories is just such a horribly, disastrously incorrect advice. Like, it doesn't jive on any level. It's the don't drink alcohol. Don't drink so much alcohol advice to the alcoholic. Helped nobody ever, right? Don't take so much cocaine. Like, helped nobody ever. Yet, don't eat so many calories is like the height of scientific understanding. Like, no. That's horribly simplistic. It's quite incorrect.
All right, Jason, I know you got to go. We're going to leave it there for today. Really enjoyed this. We're going to link up your books, the bone broth you mentioned, everything in the show notes. And as you said earlier, we're going to have a chance to go deeper on these topics in the new year. So I look forward to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse.
Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
Insulin's pushing harder, it's pushing harder, but at some point it reaches its limit. And then, no matter how hard insulin pushes, you can't shove any more glucose into that cell. And therefore, that's when the glucose